My name is Emily Rhodes, and for as long as I can remember, I was the family mistake that refused to disappear. My sister Amanda was the star, the Ivy League graduate, the golden daughter with a flawless smile and a fiancé who looked perfect on magazine covers. Me, I was the one who left home with 2 suitcases and a debt I didn't create. 8 years have passed since then. I built a life in silence, away from their whispers, away from the name that once felt like a curse. And yet when the invitation to Amanda's wedding arrived, white silk paper gold lettering, my name printed as if it still belonged, I felt something inside me shift. I didn't plan to go back, but some debts can't be ignored forever. The Fairmont Grand looked exactly as I remembered: crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and the same kind of people who measure worth in net worth. I stood in the lobby watching them raise glasses to perfection while pretending not to see me. My mother's voice echoed in my head. "Please, Emily, don't make this about you. Let Amanda have her moment." But I wasn't here for her moment. I was here for mine. In my purse was a single white envelope, plain, unmarked, silent. The kind of silence that hides something sharp. I could already feel the weight of what was inside the truth, waiting to be opened. They called me the dumb one. They had no idea what I'd brought with me to the wedding. I hadn't been back to Savannah in 8 years. The air still smelled like magnolias and salt, thick and sweet, the kind of scent that clings to your skin long after you leave. When I stepped into the lobby of the Fairmont Grand, the same place that used to host charity balls my parents forced me to attend as a teenager, I almost turned around. Everything looked the same: gold chandeliers, white roses, people who knew how to smile without meaning it. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I followed the sound of a string quartet into the ballroom. 100 faces, familiar and distant, turned toward the bride. "My sister Amanda." Her laughter floated through the air like a rehearsed melody. The kind of sound that draws attention without trying. She was glowing as always, in a custom lace gown that probably cost more than my car. I caught my mother's eyes across the room. She looked surprised, maybe even irritated that I'd actually come. She walked toward me, her perfume sharp and expensive. "Please, Emily, don't make this about you. Let Amanda have her moment." I smiled politely, the kind of smile that hides exhaustion. "Of course, Mom. I wouldn't dream of stealing the spotlight." She squeezed my arm just a little too tight and walked off before I could say another word. A server pointed me toward my seat. I followed him through a sea of sequins and champagne flutes until we reached a small table tucked beside the catering doors. Every few minutes, waiters in black aprons brushed past carrying trays of lobster rolls and sparkling rosé. My place card was handwritten, slightly crooked. Emily Rhodes. No title, no +1, no trace of belonging. I sat down and looked toward the head table. My family sat beneath a canopy of white flowers, framed like royalty. Amanda's fiancé, Michael, had that practiced smile I remembered from the day he used to drive me home from college, back when he was still mine. He'd avoided my eyes since I arrived. Someone behind me whispered, "Isn't that the sister? The one who dropped out?" Another voice chuckled, "The dumb one." The words slid into me like cold metal. I took a sip of water, pretending I hadn't heard. The truth was, I'd been called worse. The wedding planner tapped a glass, asking for attention. The music softened, and Amanda stepped up to the microphone. "I can't believe my big sister made it tonight," she said, looking right at me with that picture-perfect smile. "It means so much that you're here, Emily." Her tone was honey over glass. Everyone clapped. I raised my glass too, though my hand trembled slightly. At least she acknowledged me, I thought, though the crowd's sympathy burned hotter than their applause. A waiter leaned close, setting down a fresh glass of champagne. He hesitated. "You okay, ma'am?" I nodded. "Just fine, thank you." When he left, I looked down at the small white envelope resting beside my plate. I had chosen it carefully, simple and unmarked. It looked like nothing compared to the designer boxes and gold-wrapped gifts piled near the stage. Inside was something they would never expect. My hand brushed against it, and for a second my heartbeat steadied. Across the room, a man in a gray suit watched me. Older silver hair, eyes that seemed to know too much. He gave a slight nod. Harris. Always precise, always on time. I exhaled slowly. Everything was set. Amanda glided past my table, her bouquet brushing my shoulder. She smelled like roses and victory. "You're brave," she whispered, leaning down so only I could hear. "Coming alone." I looked up at her and smiled. "Courage isn't something I lost, Amanda. You all just stopped noticing." Her smile faltered just a fraction before she turned back toward the lights in applause. I watched her dance with Michael, the crowd circling them like planets around a sun. They were beautiful, untouchable, everything my parents ever wanted. And yet, somewhere deep down, I felt the same calm I used to feel before solving a difficult equation, the certainty that all variables were in place. The night moved slowly. Speeches, laughter, another toast. My mother's eyes kept darting toward me, wary. I sat still, polite, invisible. That was fine. They had always underestimated me when I was quiet. A guest at my table leaned over. "So, Emily, what do you do these days?" I smiled. "I help people balance things that used to seem impossible." She laughed lightly, not understanding. "How nice." When the band started another slow song, I excused myself to the hallway. The cool air hit me like relief. From here I could hear muffled chatter, clinking glasses, the rhythm of a celebration built on half-truths. I pulled the envelope from my clutch and traced my thumb along its edge. 8 years ago, I'd left Savannah with nothing but debt and silence. Tonight I brought both back wrapped neatly inside that card. Through the open doorway, I saw Harris rise from his table, adjusting his cufflinks. Our eyes met again. He nodded once more. I slipped the envelope back into my bag and walked toward the ballroom. It was almost time. The hum of the ballroom faded behind me as I stepped into the quiet corridor. My pulse steadied, and for a moment I just breathed. The scent of champagne and roses still clung to my dress, but my mind was far away back to when everything had first fallen apart. 8 years earlier, I had been 26, a finance major at the University of Georgia. I loved numbers. They made sense when people didn't. I believed in balance sheets, in the idea that if you worked hard enough, the math would always even out. Back then, my father, Richard Rhodes, was a real estate man with a talent for charm and risk. People called him a visionary. I called him Dad. The first sign of trouble came on a Sunday morning. I came home for the weekend and the house was too quiet. My mother was in the kitchen pretending to read a magazine, her coffee untouched. Dad's study door was closed, a sound I had come to fear. When I knocked, he opened it halfway, his eyes bloodshot. "We might have a small hiccup with one of the projects," he said, trying to smile. "Just a temporary cash flow issue. Nothing for you to worry about, sweetheart." I offered to help, told him I was learning about debt restructuring and capital management. He laughed, clapped me on the shoulder, said something like, "Maybe one day when you've seen the world." I didn't know then what that meant. A month later, I got a letter from the bank. A loan default notice addressed to me. The signature looked familiar. My own name written in my father's handwriting. I drove back to Savannah the same night, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just sat behind his desk, swirling scotch, looking more tired than guilty. "It was a formality, Emily. I needed collateral to finish the project." "You'll be fine. Your family, you forged my name. That's fraud." He stood, then his voice turning cold. "Don't be dramatic. You're young. You'll recover. I built this family from nothing, and I won't let pride destroy it now." My mother came in, eyes glistening, whispering that it was all a misunderstanding. My sister Amanda hovered in the hallway, pretending she wasn't listening. By the time I left that night, my credit was ruined and my father's reputation was intact. He made sure of that. Within weeks, he told people I had dropped out of college because I couldn't handle the workload. Friends stopped calling. Even my professors looked at me differently. The final blow came from Andrew Collins. He was my boyfriend back then, ambitious and charming, with plans to go into law. I told him everything, thinking honesty would matter. He listened quietly, then said he needed time to think. 2 weeks later, he stopped answering my calls. A month after that, Amanda posted a photo of the two of them at a charity gala. I didn't even have to ask. Savannah was a small town. Everyone already knew. That was the moment I packed my life into 2 suitcases and bought a one-way ticket to Chicago. Chicago was loud and cold and indifferent. It was everything Savannah wasn't, and that's what I needed. I worked wherever I could, bartending, temp, accounting, tutoring high school kids in math. I barely slept, but I started to save. Every dollar was a step away from the Rhodes family name. There were nights I cried on the train home, clutching the same worn leather bag that still smelled faintly of home. But every time I thought about my father signing my name, I straightened my back and reminded myself that silence could be armor. 3 years later, I landed a job at a small fintech startup in the Loop. The founder, a quiet man named Harris, noticed I was the first one in and the last one out. He once asked me why I worked so hard. I told him I had a debt to pay. He didn't ask to whom. Under his mentorship, I learned everything about risk analysis, investment law, and how to trace hidden assets. For the first time, I wasn't the naive girl from Savannah. I was the woman who knew how to turn loss into leverage. One night after a late meeting, Harris mentioned he used to work with a man named Richard Rhodes. My stomach dropped. I asked him quietly, "Did you know he forged his daughter's signature once?" Harris studied me, his expression unreadable. "I know more than you think," he said. "But some truths are only worth telling when they'll be heard." That sentence stayed with me. I stopped dreaming of revenge and started planning for justice. I built my own company, one that specialized in helping women recover from financial fraud and coercion. I called it White Card Initiative because it reminded me of a blank slate, something clean, after years of being written over. Each case I took brought me closer to peace, but never quite there. The wound was still open even if it no longer bled. On my 30th birthday, I opened a letter from a private bank in Atlanta. Inside was a statement listing an outstanding corporate loan, $3.2 million, taken by Rhodes Realty. My name was still on the document. It meant one thing: the debt my father had created under my identity had never been cleared. For years he had lived comfortably, his company thriving while I rebuilt myself from ashes. That night, as snow fell against my apartment window, I decided I would return to Savannah one day. Not to destroy him, but to let him face the numbers he'd created. Now standing outside the ballroom, hearing faint laughter from inside, I could feel that day arriving. I straightened my dress, checked the envelope in my clutch, and whispered to myself, "It's time for the numbers to balance, Dad." Then I walked back toward the sound of the music, ready to settle the debt he thought I'd forgotten. When I returned to Chicago after that winter visit, I carried with me a quiet purpose that grew heavier with every month. The skyline had always felt like armor to me, cold, sharp, unbothered, but now it felt like opportunity. I poured myself into work, building something that couldn't be taken away or forged in my name. By 31, I had saved enough to start my own firm. I called it White Card Initiative, a financial consultancy that helped women rebuild after being deceived or exploited by partners, relatives, or companies that treated them as signatures rather than people. I kept my name out of it. Every document was signed with 2 letters, ER. It wasn't secrecy as much as protection. The fewer people who knew Emily Rhodes had resurfaced, the longer I could work without noise. The office was small, 3 desks in a converted warehouse in River North, but it felt like freedom. I hired women who had stories like mine. A bookkeeper whose husband emptied her retirement account, a young analyst who'd been tricked by her own boss into co-signing his debts. Together we learned to trace paper trails and follow the money. Justice, I discovered, had an exact balance sheet if you knew where to look. Late one night I was reviewing quarterly reports when Harris called. His voice still carried that unhurried calm of someone who knew more than he said. He told me he'd retired from corporate law and started consulting independently. "You're not easy to find, Emily. Or should I say ER?" I smiled into the receiver. Guess the quiet strategy worked. He paused. "I came across a client file today. You might want to take a look." An hour later, an encrypted email arrived. Attached was a loan agreement from Rhodes Realty, My father's company listing White Card Initiative as a lender of record, $3.2 million outstanding. My chest tightened as I scrolled. The loan dated back 8 years, same amount, same structure as the forged contract that had destroyed my credit. It wasn't possible. Yet there it was. My father had recycled the same debt, shifting it through shell companies, until unknowingly it ended up in my own portfolio. It was poetic in a way. The debt he'd created under my name had found its way back to me. I called Harris the next morning. "You knew, didn't you?" I suspected, he said. Richard always believed the past could be buried under new paperwork. But banks keep better memories than people. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "File a lawsuit. Freeze their assets." "No, not yet. I'm going to settle it my way." He was quiet for a while. "Revenge isn't a plan, Emily. It's a leak in the foundation." "It's not revenge," I said. "It's balance." For weeks, I studied Rhodes Realty's finances. The company had grown but was fragile, dependent on new investors, heavy loans, public image. I found that my father had partnered with an events group to host luxury weddings, trying to polish the family's reputation. Their biggest upcoming contract was Amanda's wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me. Using a holding company registered under Ventures, I began acquiring shares of the events group, buying small percentages, until I reached controlling interest. Harris handled the paperwork. I handled the silence. He called one evening as I watched snowfall outside my apartment. "You realize if this goes through, you'll technically own the venue where your sister's getting married." "I know," I said. "That's the point. What are you planning to do?" "Show them what they built, and who they built it on." He hesitated. There's a fine line between justice and spectacle. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city lights reflecting off the river. "I'm not here to humiliate them, Harris. I just want them to face the math." Over the next months, I arranged everything quietly. The contract for the venue passed through my company. The checks cleared. The building with its marble floors and glass atrium was technically mine. I even paid for minor renovations that would make the ballroom gleam under the chandeliers. It would be, unknowingly to them, a stage set for truth. Every decision, every transaction carried a calm precision. I didn't feel anger anymore, just clarity, the same calm I used to feel before solving a complex equation. The day before the wedding, Harris stopped by my office. He looked older, his gray suit impeccable, his eyes sharper than ever. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure." He handed me a single folder. Inside were legal confirmations, ownership certificates, and the debt summary from Rhodes Realty, showing the unpaid $3.2 million. At the top, my initials in bold print. "Everything's clean," he said. "No one can touch you once it's revealed." "Thank you, Harris." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "There's one thing you should know. Your father's company is still using the same financial auditor. They've hidden your name in the subsidiary files. When this comes out, it won't just embarrass them. It will end them." I met his gaze. Maybe that's what endings are for. He sighed softly, gathering his coat. "Then I'll see you in Savannah." That night, I barely slept. The city outside hummed with its usual restlessness, but my thoughts were quiet. I thought about the girl who had once begged her father to be honest, the woman who had built something from nothing, and the family that still called her the dumb one. At dawn, I packed a small suitcase, slipped the white envelope into my handbag, and checked the final message from Harris. "All set. Ownership transferred. All documents ready for public disclosure." As the plane descended toward Savannah, I looked out the window at the winding rivers and marshland glinting in morning light. For the first time in years, I didn't feel dread. I felt ready. This wasn't vengeance anymore. It was arithmetic. Every lie had a number, and tonight the sum would finally make sense. The ballroom glittered that night, a cathedral of glass and music. Strings filled the air, and the rhythm of champagne flutes against crystal kept time with the applause. Everywhere I looked, people smiled too brightly, their laughter too practiced. Amanda floated through it all, perfect as a magazine cover. From where I sat at the edge of the crowd, she looked untouchable. I had arrived early to make sure everything was in place. Harris had texted me from the lobby, confirming that the final ownership filings had gone through. My name sealed in county records was now attached to the property itself. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the last line of an equation clicking into balance. As the night unfolded, speeches began. My father was the first. He stood tall at the microphone, gray hair slicked back, that same charisma that once made investors hand him their fortunes. "My daughter Amanda," he said, raising his glass, "has always been the pride of this family, hardworking, brilliant, and destined for greatness." The crowd clapped. I did not. I watched his expression, the certainty in his voice, and remembered the night he forged my name. I wondered if he felt even a flicker of guilt. When my mother took the stage, she dabbed at tears that didn't reach her eyes. "We are so blessed," she said, "to see both our daughters thriving in their own ways." The laughter that followed was polite, but the undertone was clear. One daughter had triumphed, the other was tolerated. The master of ceremonies returned to the microphone, cheerful and oblivious. "Before we move to the next course, let's read a few of the heartfelt messages our guests left for the happy couple." Servers moved through the tables, collecting envelopes from each centerpiece. The clinking of glass faded into a low murmur. When one of the waiters stopped beside me, his tray already piled high with cards, I slipped the white envelope onto it. My pulse didn't waver. He carried the stack to the front, and the MC pulled one at random. Or so he thought. Fate or math had a sense of humor. The envelope he chose was mine. A few guests giggled, probably something cute from the dumb one. I took a slow breath. The spotlight grazed my table. Amanda leaned against Michael, her husband looking entertained. The MC smiled as he tore the flap. He pulled out a folded sheet, the glint of a check catching the light. "Well, looks like a generous one," he said, grinning toward Amanda. He opened it. The grin vanished. The room shifted. I could hear every rustle of fabric, every small intake of breath. The check resting between his fingers bore my signature, and the amount $250,000. Beneath it, a printed document slid halfway out of the envelope, a property certificate issued by the state of Georgia. Ownership of the venue. Name on the title, Emily Rhodes. The silence that followed was deafening. Amanda frowned. "Is this some kind of joke?" My father stood, his smile freezing halfway. My mother's hand clutched her clutch too tightly. I rose from my seat, calm, deliberate, the sound of my heels echoing against the marble floor. I took the microphone gently from the MC's stunned hand. "No joke," I said. "Just payment. For an old debt your family forgot to settle." A ripple of confusion ran through the guests. Some whispered, others began filming. My mother took a step forward, panic flickering in her voice. "Emily, what are you doing?" "Just clarifying ownership," I said. "The woman who built this company paid for this roof once before. I thought it was fair to make it official." At the back of the room, Harris appeared, moving through the crowd with quiet precision. His gray suit caught the light as he reached the edge of the stage. He addressed the MC with professional ease. "I can confirm," he said, "that the venue's controlling interest was legally transferred to Ms. Rhodes last week. All documentation is filed and valid." Gasps rippled through the room. Amanda's bouquet slipped from her hand, petals scattering across the floor like small pieces of disbelief. My father tried to speak, but no words came. I turned toward him. "Dad, you taught me that numbers never lie. Tonight they finally told the truth." A few guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to stay or escape. I set the microphone down on the podium and stepped back, letting the weight of silence finish what I started. Amanda looked around helplessly, her perfect posture unraveling. Her husband whispered something in her ear, but she shook her head. The string quartet had stopped playing. Even the air felt heavier. My mother's voice cracked. "Emily, please, this isn't the time." "Maybe not for you," I said, "but it's long overdue for me." The tension broke when Harris handed an envelope to the MC. Inside were copies of the legal transfer forms, notarized, stamped, and dated. He didn't have to say anything else. The signatures spoke for themselves. Someone near the bar muttered, "She owns the place." The truth spread faster than champagne spills. Cameras flashed. The hum of whispered disbelief became a low roar. I stepped away from the stage past Amanda, who stared at me as if trying to recognize the sister she'd erased. "You didn't have to do this," she said under her breath. "No," I replied. "I wanted to. There's a difference." Outside the ballroom windows, the night pressed dark against the glass, the city lights trembling on the river. I thought of all the years I'd lived quietly, letting them define me. Tonight, silence had spoken louder than any speech. As I reached the door, Harris caught my arm. "You sure you're ready for what comes next?" I met his eyes. "This isn't the end, Harris. It's the opening line." He nodded, understanding, as 100 voices erupted behind us, the sound of a world beginning to unravel. The noise inside the ballroom rose and fractured, a tide of shock rolling through 100 expensive suits. Guests whispered, phones came out. Someone laughed too loudly just to break the tension. Harris stood beside me, his calm, the only steady thing in the chaos. Richard was still frozen at the head table, his jaw locked, his drink untouched. For a moment, he looked smaller than I remembered, not the titan who once filled every room, but a man who had run out of air. Harris walked toward him, weaving through the tables. I followed. The crowd shifted, giving way like ripples in water. When we reached him, Harris handed over a sealed envelope. Richard hesitated before opening it. His hands shook slightly, the cuff of his shirt damp from sweat. Inside was a stack of papers and a letter in familiar handwriting. I recognized the stationery before I saw the words. It was from Thomas Baker, the family's former financial advisor, the one who had guided my father through his rise and had died 2 years earlier. The handwriting was steady, old-fashioned. If Emily was ever called foolish, it is only because honesty will always look naive beside deception. My father's lips pressed into a line. He looked up at Harris. "What is this supposed to prove, that the truth was documented?" Harris said. "Thomas kept copies of everything, including the original loan. You forged her name, Richard. I was there when the bank questioned it. You begged me to stay silent." The room quieted again. Amanda took a step forward, her face pale. "Dad," he tried to steady his voice, "everything I did was for the family." "For the family," I repeated softly. "You destroyed mine for yours." He turned toward me, desperation creeping into his tone. "You don't understand what it's like to hold everything together to protect what we built." I met his eyes. "Family isn't built on forged signatures, Dad. It's built on trust." Amanda looked at me, then at Andrew, her new husband, as realization set in. The luxury she flaunted, the house, the wedding, all of it had been paid for with money stolen from me. Andrew's face drained of color. He stepped back, avoiding her gaze. Someone in the crowd whispered that the police would get involved. Another said this was better than any courtroom drama. The hum grew louder again. My mother moved toward Harris, pleading, "Please, stop this. There's no need to humiliate us further." Harris's tone stayed even. "No one's humiliating anyone. We're just letting the facts breathe for the first time." He opened another envelope, smaller, containing a USB drive. He handed it to the event manager, who connected it to the projector behind the stage. I didn't know he had done this until I saw the file name appear on screen. Rhodes, 2015, audio. A voice filled the speakers, low and familiar, tired but unmistakable. My father's. "They'll never find out. The loan's in her name. She'll think it was canceled when she dropped out. It's cleaner this way." Gasps cut through the silence. My father lunged toward the sound technician, shouting to stop it, but Harris blocked him, voice calm as ever. "Don't make it worse, Richard." Amanda covered her mouth, eyes wide. Andrew stared at the floor. My mother swayed slightly, a server catching her arm. The room had turned into a witness stand. When the audio stopped, I didn't move. I felt no triumph, only a strange quiet, like standing at the eye of a storm that had finally reached its center. I turned toward Harris. "You went further than I expected." He nodded. The truth deserved its full sentence. The guests started to gather their things, murmuring apologies they didn't owe anyone. I could see phones already flashing messages, flying out into the night. By morning, Savannah would know. My father tried to speak again, his voice breaking. Emily, I can fix this. We can fix this together. There's nothing to fix, I said. There's only what's left. Amanda's mascara streaked down her face. Her hands shook as she took off her wedding ring and placed it on the table. Andrew didn't stop her. The photographers once hired to capture happiness were now documenting collapse. I caught one's eye. He hesitated, but I nodded. Let them see it, I said quietly. Truth deserves witnesses too. As I stepped away, the orchestra began playing again out of reflex, a soft instrumental meant to fill the silence. It only made the scene more surreal. Harris joined me near the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was something like respect in his eyes. You could have destroyed him completely, he said. But you didn't. I didn't come here for revenge, I said. Just recognition. He looked at the crowd behind us. I think you got more than that. Outside, the night air hit cold against my skin. The sound from inside was muffled now, like a memory being sealed shut. I could hear sirens somewhere distant, probably not for us, but fitting all the same. I stopped on the steps and looked back once. Through the ballroom glass, my family stood divided. My mother holding her husband upright, Amanda sitting alone at the edge of the stage, Harris speaking quietly to the manager. By morning, the headlines would write themselves. The dumb one exposes her family's fraud at sister's wedding. I walked toward the waiting car Harris had arranged, my heels clicking against the stone. He caught up just before I reached the door. It's out there now, he said. You don't have to say another word. Good, I replied. The truth can talk for me. He smiled faintly and opened the door. As we drove away, flashes still lit the ballroom windows like small bursts of lightning. The city shimmered ahead, unaware that a family name had just collapsed under its own weight. For the first time in years, I didn't feel angry. I felt clean. Some debts, I realized, were never meant to be collected. They just had to be revealed. The morning after the wedding, Savannah woke up to headlines that felt like a thunderclap. Every paper, every local broadcast carried the same phrase, Savannah heiress wedding scandal. The photos were everywhere. Amanda crying on stage, my father caught mid-yell me, walking away in that black dress that suddenly looked sharper than armor. I didn't need to open my phone to know my inbox was flooded. Harris called just after dawn. It's out, he said simply. I know. You should stay out of sight for a while. I looked out the window of my hotel room at the river stretching toward the Atlantic. I wasn't hiding. I was watching something end. By noon, Rhodes Realty stock had dropped 40%. Investors panicked. Partners pulled out of joint projects. The local business journal released a statement from the board suspending my father pending investigation. It was surreal to see his name printed beside words like misconduct and fraud. Television crews parked outside the Rhodes estate waiting for a comment. Amanda's face, once plastered on charity event posters, now filled gossip sites with headlines about a canceled honeymoon and a husband who refused to speak. My mother's friends unfollowed her social media. The life they had built on appearances was crumbling in real time. Harris handled most of the calls that came to me. He filtered the interview requests, legal inquiries, invitations to morning shows. I said no to everything until one reporter from a financial magazine reached out through his office. She wasn't after gossip. She wanted to talk about silence and justice. We met in a coffee shop in downtown Chicago 3 days later. She was young, serious, her recorder resting between us like a truth detector. She asked if I was angry. Anger was the fuel at first, I said, stirring my coffee. But it burns out fast. What's left after that is math. Choices and consequences. I never wanted them ruined. I just wanted the truth to count for something again. She nodded, eyes wide. You don't want revenge, then? Revenge is temporary, I told her. Recognition lasts longer. The article went live 2 days later with the title The Quiet Accountant Who Brought Down Her Family. It went viral. Strangers sent messages thanking me for proving that silence could still have power. A few told me their own stories of betrayal and survival. I read every one. Meanwhile, Harris kept me updated on the legal side. The IRS had opened an audit. The Securities Commission was reviewing Rhodes Realty's books. My father's lawyers were trying to delay everything, but the paper trail was too clean, too precise. Every file he'd ever buried was surfacing. Amanda called once. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was small, cracked. She didn't apologize, just said she hoped I was safe and that Mom wasn't eating. I deleted the message but couldn't forget the tremor in her tone. That night my mother sent an email. Only one sentence. "You were right, and I am sorry." I stared at the screen for a long time, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat. Then I replied with a single link to the White Card Initiative website. At the top of the homepage in plain serif font was the motto I had written years earlier. Truth has no interest rate. It pays itself. I didn't need to say anything more. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my work quietly. The office buzzed with new cases and clients who had seen the article. They wanted help reclaiming what was taken from them, not just money, but dignity. Every story reminded me why I had started in the first place. Harris visited one afternoon bringing pastries and updates. "Your father's resigned," he said. "They'll probably strip him of his license, too." I set down my pen. "And Mom, keeping her distance, trying to sell the house before the creditors do. And Amanda." He hesitated. "She filed for annulment, moved into a friend's apartment. She's lost, I think." For a moment, guilt tugged at me, soft and confusing. But then I remembered the years of silence, the debt, the look in my father's eyes when he lied. Justice wasn't cruelty. It was simply truth catching up. A few days later, a letter arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a photo of my parents standing in front of a small suburban house, no chauffeur, no marble driveway. My mother's handwriting on the back read, "We're learning to live small. Maybe that's where life starts to make sense." I left the photo on my desk. I didn't know how to feel. Relief, maybe. Sadness, definitely. Mostly peace, the kind that comes when the noise finally stops. By the end of the month, the scandal began to fade from the news cycle. A new story replaced it. The world moved on. But in Savannah, people still whispered when they passed the old Rhodes building, now stripped of its sign. One evening, I walked by the river after work, the Chicago air sharp and clean. The water reflected the city lights like shattered glass. For the first time, I let myself think not of loss, but of legacy. My father's empire had fallen, but from its collapse, something steadier was being built. When Harris called later that night, he told me the board had voted to dissolve Rhodes Realty completely. I thanked him and hung up, closing my laptop. Everything had come full circle. I hadn't needed to destroy them. The truth had done it for me. I stood by the window, the skyline glowing in the distance, and whispered to the quiet city beneath me. Justice doesn't shout. It simply arrives. Then I turned off the lights and let the silence stay a little longer, knowing that tomorrow a new chapter would begin. A year later, the city felt different. Chicago's air was still cold and restless, but my life had settled into something steady, something that finally made sense. The White Card Foundation opened its doors in a renovated brick building near the river. The front windows carried our name in simple black letters, understated yet impossible to miss. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs of the women we had helped, teachers, single mothers, entrepreneurs, each one a reminder that rebuilding was possible. The boardroom that used to host my financial firm now served as a training center. Women sat in small groups learning about credit recovery, small business loans, and how to protect their identities. Watching them laugh and take notes filled me with a quiet pride that no applause could match. Harris came to the opening ceremony standing in the back as he always did. When I spotted him afterward, he was sipping coffee from a paper cup, ignoring the reporters who wanted quotes. "You did it," he said simply. "No," I said, "we did." He smiled, the kind of smile that meant he wouldn't argue. He had become the closest thing I had to a father figure. We didn't talk about my real one anymore. There was no point. The Rhodes name had vanished from public view. My parents lived quietly in a small house outside Atlanta. Sometimes my mother sent postcards, always with pictures of gardens and a single line about the weather. I never replied, but I kept them in a drawer. One afternoon, as I was reviewing grant applications, my assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone asking for you," she said. "She says she's your sister." For a moment, my breath caught. I hadn't heard Amanda's voice since that voicemail after the wedding. I told my assistant to send her in. Amanda stepped into the room slowly, her hair shorter, her makeup gone. She looked younger, almost like the version of her I remembered from before ambition hardened her edges. "You look well," she said quietly. "So do you." I lied, though the truth was written in her tired eyes. She hesitated, clutching a folder. "I want to start over, Emily. I don't want money or sympathy, just a chance to work, even if it's the lowest job here." I studied her for a long time. Part of me wanted to say no, the part that still remembered the laughter at that wedding, the pity in her voice. But something in her expression stopped me. Maybe it was humility, maybe exhaustion. "All right," I said finally. "We need an accounting assistant. It's tedious work, long hours." "I'll take it," she said before I even finished. She started the following Monday. At first she struggled. Numbers weren't her strength, but she showed up early and stayed late. She made coffee for the interns, took notes during seminars, and asked questions no one expected her to ask. Slowly, the walls between us began to soften. One evening, I found her sitting alone in the conference room, surrounded by spreadsheets. She looked up and smiled weakly. "I used to think people like these women were failures," she said. "But they're stronger than anyone I've ever met." "You sound like someone who's learning," I said. She nodded. "For the first time, maybe I am." Weeks turned into months. The foundation grew faster than I imagined. We secured national grants, built partnerships with banks, and launched mentorship programs. Reporters began calling me the quiet power behind the women's finance movement. The phrase stuck. During a television interview one morning, the host asked me about the nickname, "the dumb one," that had circulated years ago. I smiled for the camera and said, "People called me that because I stayed quiet. But sometimes silence isn't ignorance. It's strategy." The interview went viral again, but this time for all the right reasons. Donations poured in. Clients doubled. Amanda watched from her desk, and when I walked past later, she whispered, "I'm proud of you." It was strange hearing it, but not unpleasant. Harris dropped by more often now, bringing files and fatherly advice. He would sit in my office telling me stories about his early cases and laughing about how small victories used to feel enormous. One afternoon, he looked around the room, taking in the sight of women busy at work, their voices overlapping with quiet determination. "You built something real, Emily," he said. "Something that will outlive the scandal." "That was the plan," I said softly. "To replace noise with meaning." He left before evening, and I stood by the window watching the city lights blink on, one by one. The reflection of my own face in the glass looked calm, older, maybe wiser. At the far end of the office, Amanda was cleaning up after a workshop, stacking chairs and collecting papers. She caught my eye and gave a small wave. On her desk sat a white envelope used as a bookmark in her notebook. I recognized it immediately, the same one from that night. She had written something on it in blue ink. "Thank you for teaching me what smart really means." I didn't say anything. I just smiled and turned back toward the window. Outside, the river shimmered in the city's glow, and for the first time in years, I felt completely free. The past no longer chased me. It had folded itself neatly into something useful. Tomorrow we would announce the Foundation's national expansion, and a new chapter would begin, not for revenge, but for redemption. And for the first time, I was ready to share the silence. 3 years passed faster than I expected. The White Card Foundation had grown from a small office in Chicago to a national network with branches in 12 states. The anniversary gala filled the same hall that once hosted my sister's wedding. This time the lights were warmer, the laughter real. Women I had met through the program sat at round tables, their faces glowing with something more powerful than wealth. It was pride. I stood backstage holding a speech I barely needed to read. The walls were lined with photographs from the last 3 years, a mother opening her first business, a teacher buying her own home, a young woman finishing college after escaping debt. Every story had started with a single piece of paper, a white card. Amanda found me in the hallway, carrying a clipboard and wearing a name badge that said, Program Director. She had grown into her role with a quiet confidence I never thought I'd see in her. Her eyes still softened whenever she looked at me. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." When the lights dimmed and the music faded, I stepped onto the stage. The audience rose in applause. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I looked out over the crowd and saw Harris standing in the back, his silver hair catching the light. At the far end of the room, my parents sat side by side, not in the front row, but near the exit, their hands clasped tightly together. My mother gave a small nod. My father looked down, his eyes glistening. I took a breath and began. 3 years ago, this foundation started with nothing more than a mistake and a lesson. I held up a framed white card, the same one from that night in Savannah. It once represented humiliation. Tonight, it represents freedom. The applause was gentle, almost reverent. This card reminds me that silence is not weakness. I continued, it's the pause before clarity. Every woman here has faced something that tried to define her, but we write our own definitions now. The crowd rose again, clapping, cheering, some wiping tears. I caught Amanda watching me, her hands together, in quiet applause. After the speeches, we gathered around a table where Harris presented me with a small white envelope. It was worn, sealed with his careful handwriting. "From an old friend," he said. "Found it while sorting my archives." Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper. The letter was from Thomas Baker, my father's former advisor, the man who had once written about my honesty. The words were faded but clear. "Freedom isn't given. It's earned when you stop asking for approval." I folded it carefully and looked at Harris. He smiled. "You've done well, Emily." He paused, glancing at Amanda across the room. "You all have." When the evening ended, the guests lingered, laughing and taking photos under a banner that read, "Financial Freedom for Women." Amanda stood on stage, announcing the new initiative she had designed herself. She spoke with conviction about mentorship and education, about giving women the tools to control their futures. Her voice didn't tremble once. In the back row, my parents stayed seated long after the lights dimmed. When I approached, my mother stood first. She didn't say much, only took my hand and whispered, "We're proud of you." My father remained seated, looking up at me, like he was seeing me for the first time. He simply said, "You were right, and I'm sorry." I nodded. That was enough. Later, when the hall was empty and the last guests had gone, I walked through the quiet space collecting a few forgotten programs. The air smelled faintly of coffee and flowers. Amanda joined me, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "To the women who taught us what strength looks like," she said. "And to the people who learned how to listen?" I replied. We clinked glasses softly. In my office the next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, landing on the framed white card that hung above my desk. The edges had yellowed, the ink had faded, but it remained the heart of everything. Beneath it, I placed Thomas's letter in a new frame side by side with the Foundation's charter. Past and present, both written proof of what silence could build. Amanda peeked into the room, a stack of reports in her arms. "You're not going to believe this," she said, laughing. "We just hit 2,000 clients help this year." I smiled. "Then let's aim for double next year." When she left, I stood for a moment watching the city through the glass. The river shimmered like liquid silver, the noise of traffic distant and steady. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who left Savannah with 2 suitcases and a debt she didn't create. She would have never imagined this life. I whispered to the empty office, "They once called me the dumb one. Now I call myself free." The hum of the city filled the silence, not loud, just enough to remind me I was still here. Sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest stories. Sometimes silence doesn't mean surrender. It means you're waiting for the right moment to be heard. If this story has ever mirrored a part of your own, stay a while. Tell me what you would have done, if they called you the dumb one. Because every story, when finally spoken, finds someone who needed to hear it.